Back with Greg Shaheen as we begin the process of sorting through the rest of these at-larges. And I think it's interesting to know, we're looking at this from the point of view of the Big Ten and to see how these Big Ten teams end up making it into the bracket where they end up, and maybe some who don't get into the bracket. But from the committee's point of view, they are never focusing on how many teams make it from a particular league.
Yeah, throughout the entire weekend, that won't even come up as the committee looks at it. Bearing in mind that when they're looking at the individual resumes of the teams, they are seeing conference and non-conference, and obviously they know what conference affiliation a particular team has, I guess if they haven't gotten too confused from realignment, but they'll look at what the overall resume is and never take into account references to the conference as they go forward.
But you would never say this conference is the best one in the country and therefore they ought to have the most teams or anything like that.
That's right. Specifically, a few years ago, the committee removed conference RPI from the reports and from the room so that they don't go there, because it was much ado about nothing. The bottom line is the committee has so much data available to it and those full bodies of work to look at, they don't need to get into the business of composite conference RPI.
How do you weigh the conference tournament versus the regular season?
You have to take it all into account. It's full body of work. So we play in November, we play all the way through March. So you have to take that into account. The committee will look at injuries, player availability, obviously, as it goes into that. Perhaps if there was a weather delay, we had several games this year that had to be rescheduled, or there were travel delays as you go forward. So the committee will know all of that information as well. But as you get into the conference tournaments, it really comes down to the nitty-gritty. These are some of the finest lines that can be drawn. The committee also will be very careful to not overemphasize what happens in the conference tournament. It's important, there's no doubt about it, but you also want to make sure that you don't have fall in love with a brand just because of a strong run in a conference tournament alone.
And one of the challenges is these conference tournaments are going on right as you are constructing this bracket. In fact, in some cases, the championship games are concluded a half hour or so before the bracket comes out, including the Big Ten.
Yeah, to me, it's what keeps the NCAA staff young, that supports the committee. They will be working on contingencies and setting things up to make sure that every possible scenario is into account. Where it becomes tricky is if you have a team that can only get in as the AQ. And that's where you have to have alternate scenarios set up as you go forward. And it makes it more exciting, let's say, in the selection room on Sunday. You know, it's boring on that last day, so it keeps everybody off of nap time and so forth.
So if you have a team that wasn't going to get in otherwise, that's in, let's say, the Big Ten championship game, you've got two brackets, one if they win and one if they lose. That's simple.
I mean, quite honestly, now the bracketing process is done with so much information available to it that they can assemble contingencies, a half dozen contingencies if they need to, and in the past few years we had.
Again, let's go from the theory to the practical as we rejoin Mike and Jerry over here. And guys, we've gotten a little bit of an overview of how this filling out of the at-large pool works here once you get past those 1 and 2 seeds. The committee's considering all this in the span of 5 days. You guys, somewhat miraculously, I think, did it in the span of an hour. Let's just focus in on the Big Ten teams here. And I think there are several where it's pretty clear they're going to get in. The issue is just how will the committee view them? How will they be seated? Let's start with you, Jerry, in Michigan State.
Yeah, Michigan State is going to be an interesting case for the committee because that's one of those teams that's had a lot of injuries this year. You know, healthy Michigan State through November and December looked like one of the best teams in the country, and then that team disappeared and just reappeared again, sort of, at the with the Illinois game this past weekend. I mean, I think Keith Appling's wrist is always going to be a problem, but this is as healthy as Michigan State's going to get. This is a team with a number of high-quality wins, really a pretty good resume, but they also have had their 3 worst losses of the year in the last 2 weeks. So they've got to kind of regain their footing. We put Michigan State as a 5 seed, but I think there's room for Michigan State to go up through these last 2 weeks because they're going to be playing good teams in the Big Ten in the regular season and the tournament.
The argument has been made all along that if they have their full roster, maybe they're the best team in the country. They had their full roster this weekend, and they certainly didn't look like it. But again, you could make the case that if they play very well here down the stretch, maybe that moves them up and they do get the benefit of the doubt. Iowa is an interesting one as well because they have faltered a bit of late, Mike.
Yeah, don't get caught up too much in what they're doing lately unless it contributes to an overall body of work. Again, not a hard team to seed, really, because they have no bad losses virtually, so you don't put them deep in the field, but they're lacking in high-level wins, only 1 and 6 against the RPI top 25, and that's what keeps you from being higher on the bracket. If they went through the Big Ten tournament, did a lot of damage there, they could climb as high as a 5 perhaps, put them in that range, maybe even a 4 if they won it. But as it stands now, without those high-level victories, really no place on the bracket for Iowa other than a 7.
Ohio State is the other team in the Big Ten that seems like they are clearly an NCAA tournament team, although they, like Iowa, like Michigan State, haven't necessarily hurt or helped their cause here down the stretch. But where do you put the Buckeyes?
Well, we have the Buckeyes as a 6, and Ohio State has got a high number of top 100 wins. They've got 11. The thing is that they've got a lot of home cooking in there. They won on the road at Wisconsin and at Iowa, and those 2 wins are huge for their seeding. They're a bubble team, maybe, if they don't have those 2 wins. And part of their problem is that they haven't been able to beat Penn State. Home and road losses to Penn State, the 2 bad losses on the Ohio State resume. This team has not been as consistent as I think most people expected, and I think that that's reflected in the 6 seed that we gave them.
But again, barring epic collapses, these teams seem like they're fairly safely into the dance. The issue isn't for them if they'll be seeded.
I'm not even sure there's a collapse epic. I think they could
There's
lose all the rest and still make it.
I mean, if they were
No
in the
way
SEC,
they're
it'd be
left out.
different, but they're playing Big Ten teams.
Right.
So the epic collapse, I'm not even sure where that comes from for these teams.
Okay, so those teams safely in,
Yeah.
no question about it, no doubt. Now there are a couple of Big Ten teams who are on what we like to call the proverbial bubble, of course, and the situation is very different for them, and we will consider those teams next. Do Minnesota and Nebraska have what it takes to get in? We will consider those few precious spots coming up.